I get often is, how do you integrate your Christian faith into the counseling session? So that's a great question. I work half-time as a pastor, and then I work half-time as a counselor. I work mostly with couples and then with men who might be resistant to therapy, who have a lot of responsibility. Oftentimes these are pastors or vicars or even politicians working with them. It's very normal for people to be very suspicious of me at the beginning. And so I like to make things very clear. So in terms of integrating faith, there was an old theologian named Francis Schaeffer who called man is like a glorious ruin. So there's deeply broken things in humanity, which we all know, but there are also things that are very glorious. And so whenever I'm working with someone, I'm trying to figure out through either a theological lens, a psychological lens, or a biological lens what it's like for them to be human. So for a lot of people, if they're playing a one-string guitar, their background is very ruinous, and so it's hard to think about some of the positive parts. Or they've come from this idealized background where it's difficult to talk about negative things, or difficult to talk about sin, or things that may have been broken for them growing up. Terry Real, who's a very helpful counselor, he says that we all have an adaptive child, that things that we had to do to survive growing up, even if our home was relatively happy growing up, they're everything that we had to do but we all sort of bear some of these scars, not just in our psychology, but even in our biology. That trauma, as a famous book says, the body keeps the score in terms of what's held. And the pathway to comfort, as Jesus says, blessed, happy, fortunate is the one who mourns, for they will be comforted. And so the kind of the paradoxical pathway to comfort is through mourning. And one thing that all of my clients want when they start is comfort. And as we know from Psalm 126, those that sow with tears reap with joy. There's something about this process of beginning to find our language of lament. Sometimes even just utilizing Psalms can be very helpful. And yet, I work with a lot of people who are not coming from the Christian faith or have been deeply wounded by the church, whether it be from a pastor or from someone who's been sexually abused or physically abused from someone that have utilized a kind of a theological lens as they've done it. It's really helpful to be able to start with the psychological, or start with the biological. So to begin to, as the proverb says, man's heart is like a deep water, and the one with understanding draws it out. And so the first sessions are oftentimes giving dignity to all the things that you've done thus far, to be able to manage some of this chaotic part internally. Because this is what sin does. It disintegrates us from ourselves. It disintegrates our bodies. It disintegrates our emotions. It disintegrates our spirituality. And oftentimes in counseling, we're trying to reintegrate some of those parts so that we can be accessible, responsive, and engaged relationally now. And so when we think about how faith works, I'll certainly often say to clients, is it okay if I use a biological lens here? Is it okay if I use a psychological lens? Because I think it will actually serve some of the faith parts of where do we see actually the message of Christ, the truth of the gospel, actually with other frames in a way that can be very helpful. But for clients that really want to hear more specifically, feel free to reach out. I love to have introductory conversations because at the end of the day, this time is for you. And if you really want to be able to integrate your faith, I think that I'll be a real help in that part, because to be able to have faith is such an asset. I oftentimes say, if you kind of think about through this psychological lens, our relationship with Christ, our relationship with God is like the secure attachment that we long for in every other relationship. We want someone that's always accessible, that will always love us, that has such a high regard for us and will never betray us and never leave us. That is the picture. And if we can really begin to integrate some of that love in our faith, but also in our relationships, we can be, as it says, Adam and Eve were before the fall, we can be naked and unashamed, totally exposed and totally protected, totally seen and loved all the way to the bottom and forgiven. And that's kind of the horizon of what I see health as, is to be naked and unashamed, both in the context of marriage, but also even for those that are coming in for individual work. Can we begin to see ourselves as safe and protected, not only in our relationships, but in our relationship with Christ, so that we can begin to live these very interesting, creative, and vulnerable lives in light of the good news of the gospel. Thanks so much.